Integrative psychology. This is history and introduction to defining mental illness. We're going to talk a little bit about psychology, disorders, and stigma. Defining psychology, disorders, and stigma. So knowing that psychology is concerned with the nature, development, and treatment of mental health issues, often termed disorders. Disorders are defined as a problem or set of problems which can result in disruptions of a person's daily life, oftentimes creating difficulty, distress, and/or impairments. Stigma is defined as held beliefs of one group toward another group that are often seen or believed to be destructive. The thing is that policies and procedures that are harmful to the stigmatized group include things like microaggression and microtrauma, and this can be the result of labeling and discrimination. Knowledge has not resulted in a decrease. However, social media and public figures speaking about their mental health struggles has been helpful. And as tragic as it may seem, even those that have passed have spurred conversations about things that we have not talked about even just for the last few years. When we look at historical perspectives, where did our current ideas come from? So the early Greek philosophers attributed disturbances to angering the gods, religious punishment, magic, and even superstition. So Hippocrates, who is oftentimes seen as the father of modern medicine, is accredited with advancing thought to see illnesses of all kinds being related to natural causes. He regarded the brain as the organ of consciousness, intellect, and emotion, and saw brain pathology as the cause of disordered thinking and behavior. And his work prevailed for several hundred years, having been adopted by both Greeks and Romans. We can look at Galen, who followed the Hippocratic ideas about health and disease, first to use a systematic and experimental method to determine medical issues. The church and monastic repositories during the Dark Ages, which is between the 5th and the 14th century, looked at health and healing in the realm of religious guidance. Continuing with the historical perspectives of mental health, we look to the 13th century when municipalities began to gain more power. There was the lunacy trials in Europe. The term comes from the belief that odd or disruptive behavior was the result of planetary misalignments, lune being the moon, luna being associated with the moon, and that's where the term came from. So people with psychological disturbances were often hospitalized. The idea ultimately was to protect people. So many of the ideas about mental health ended up coming from Europe to the United States. The treatment for disorders also came from Europe, and many of the treatments were actually quite cruel, including prolonged ice baths, isolation, and even full body binding. The term asylums, which is centers for treatment of those with mental health issues, were often created from converted hospitals that were no longer in use. One of the first one is Bethlehem, which is where Bedlam, the word Bedlam, comes from, and it ultimately ended up becoming a tourist attraction, as did the Lunatics Tower in Vienna. In the United States, it was also the Salem witch trials from 1692 to 1693, and most of the people that were accused of witchcraft were women, and it was thought that many of them had seizure disorders or lead poisoning. Some may even have had what we call schizophrenia or some other mental health disorder. And some of them were just not behaving the way society at the time wanted them to. Then there was the beginning of some of the reformations. There is a man by the name of Philippe Pinel, which is called Pinel's Reform, and he pioneered some humane treatment in asylums. So people should be approached with compassion and dignity, which was one of his primary tenets. And at the time, humanitarian treatment was ultimately reserved for the upper class people. So he began kind of creating this reformation that everybody deserved some kind of treatment, regardless of what class they belonged to. The moral treatments, which was originally established by the Quakers. There is the Friends Asylum in Pennsylvania, which was established in 1817. It was a small, privately funded humanitarian mental hospital. People there were engaged in purposeful activities, things like gardening, arts and crafts, tending to livestock, things like that. They talked with attendants and led lives as close to normal as possible, which was a complete departure from the way that the way that people had been treated up until that point. There's a man by the name of Benjamin Rush who lived from 1745 to 1813, and he was considered to be the father of American psychiatry. Something to understand and take into consideration about him is that he was actually an abolitionist, and he was involved in the anti-slavery movement. However, he also believed that skin color was important to the protection from or cause of many diseases. He had some ideas about mental health disorders, and treatment were a sign of the times, things like bloodletting, the use of leeches, etc. Moving on to Dorothea Dix, who was alive from 1802 to 1887, was truly a crusader for improved conditions for people with both physical and mental health issues. She worked to reform inhumane treatment of the mentally ill and indigenous peoples. She worked to establish public hospitals to care for those that could not afford care. She took many of the people whom private hospitals would not or could not accommodate, and she dedicated herself to the treatment of wounded during the American Civil War on both sides, both Union and Confederate soldiers. She pushed for formal training of female nurses and medical staff, and she continued to fight for reform until she passed away. Beginning with psychological approaches, we will start with Anton Mesmer. He was alive between 1734 and 1815, and the idea, his belief was that hysteria was caused by a disruption of a universal magnetic fluid in the body. He used rods and stairs to influence the fluid and induce behavioral change. He was an early practitioner of hypnosis, and this is where the term mesmerism or mesmerize comes from. Charcot was alive between 1825 and 1893. He was a neurologist who initially specialized in gerontology, the diseases of joints and lungs, anatomy, physiology, and pathology of the nervous system, and he worked at Salpêtrière, where Sigmund Freud studied. His support and work truly legitimized hypnosis as treatment for what was then called hysteria. Wundt was regarded as the father of modern psychology, and his focus was on experimental aspects. He was interested in the workings of the mind as a structure. He was instrumental in creating research legitimacy in the field of psychology, something that the field had struggled with for decades. He was a physiologist, and he was curious about and analyzed thoughts and sensations, stimulus and response, which I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. He was into reductionism, which he believed that the consciousness could be reduced to basic elements, that observations of self and other through careful experimentation would answer the questions about human psychological function. The basic premise was that thoughts, images, and feelings should be the focus of mental functioning. This is what we now think of as cognitive psychology. When we talk about psychoanalytic theory, of course, we have to begin with Sigmund Freud. He was alive between 18 1956 and 1939. The whole idea of his work was that psychopathology resulted from unconscious conflicts, that mind is divided into three principal parts: the id, which is the deepest, most primitive; the ego, which works to mediate between the id and the superego, which pushes for moral superiority. So the id, ego, and superego are continually in conflict, which creates a great deal of anxiety. There are things like defense mechanisms, which are strategies used by the ego to protect itself from anxiety. Interestingly enough, Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who went on to become a very prominent psychoanalyst herself, really developed, increased the development and the understanding of defense mechanisms. So the next person, Joseph Breuer, alive between 1842 and 1925, used hypnosis to facilitate catharsis in a famous patient named Anna O, who was really the person that gave the term the talking cure to the work that both Breuer and Freud were doing. And Breuer and Freud were actually friends. They worked together. They were colleagues until, of course, they had a famous falling out, but that's what happened with just about anybody that was around Sigmund Freud. So the cathartic model, the cathartic method, is a release of emotional tension triggered by expressing previously forgotten thoughts. It is related to an earlier emotional trauma. Some of the continuing influences of Sigmund Freud is that childhood experiences help to shape adult personality. Up until that point, it was pretty much believed that children were just born as blank slates. That kind of got re-upped again in the 50s with some behaviorism. So the idea behind that was that childhood experiences and environmental events are crucial. That was a pretty contemporary thinking, and it was pretty revolutionary. Early relationships influence adult relationships. So there are unconscious influences on behavior, and that people can be unaware of the cause of their behavior. So the causes and purpose of human behavior are not always obvious. The purpose was to look under the surface to find hidden meaning in behavior. And this brought about some thinking of Adler and Jung and Rank, Ferenczi, Anna Freud, Klein, and countless others. So much of the language that we use in therapy is really some of the things that Freud, some of his earliest works. So Freud and the work of those and the students that followed him and his peers were, again, really influential in how we continue to think and talk about therapy to this day. Some current concepts of mental health. This comes from the American Psychiatric Association, and it is a health condition that involves changes in emotion regulation, thinking, and or behavior, which is often associated with distress. It may result in problems functioning socially, with family, and at work. There can be changes in productivity, relationships, and ability to cope when distressed. Some interesting statistics are that 19% of the U.S. adult population experience mental health illness in some form, and 4% of U.S. adults have serious mental illness, which is sometimes referred to as SPMI, or serious persistent mental illness. 8.5% of adults have a diagnosable substance use disorder, or SUD. So good mental health is seen as the foundation for emotion regulation, thinking, communication, learning, resilience, and self-esteem. Multiple components to mental health. There are those that believe it's all nature and some who ascribe to all nurture, but most see it as a combination of both. So in summary, mental illness throughout history, there's been tremendous numbers of changes that have happened over the last 300 years, including treatment and outcome for those that experience challenges with their mental health. There's ever-evolving attitudes and belief. Sadly, change often doesn't come soon enough for some, with suicide rates increasing and rising stressors from social and political dysfunction. there's still a lot of stigma that continues to exist. I do believe that there is hope that we collectively can and will continue to evolve, increasing awareness and identifying and treating psychological, behavioral, and emotional health issues. And we're just moving forward all the time. Prevalence of stigma continues on to this day, and just knowing some of the current concepts can really help to create a structure around people that you may be treating, people that will be coming into your office. And of course, there are a couple of references.